welcome to the 2024 ND Demolition Debate. You all have 4 pieces of flow paper to use during the debate. I'll just remind you, you will not need a computer during the debate. You should flow by ear. All the evidence that you'll hear today will be from the ND packet, and these 4 debaters can go a lot faster, but today they will not be going their top speed. Even if you normally flow on a computer, today please flow on paper. Camp is about trying new stuff, and all of your lab leaders and lab assistants want you to flow on paper. Try your best. Alicia has a cool template on the board for if you have not had a chance yet to put some labels at the top of your sheet if you're still kind of new to debate for what the speech names are, and has advised you to use 2 different colors so that you can easily, at an arm's length away, see what the affirmative arguments are and what the negative arguments are. If you don't have 2 different colors, make a friend nearby you, and I bet you can trade off. And so you can both still have 2 different colors for when the app is talking, when the neg is talking. I would also leave a bunch of space at the top of the page for just in case. You never know, the 2AC or the 2NC or the 1NR might have an overview, and you don't want that to mess up your line by line. Before we start the debate, I want to introduce the debaters for you. On the affirmative team, we have the team of Laurel and Dawn. Let's give them a round of applause. Laurel is a rising sophomore and college debater at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama. Laurel's originally from Irondale, Alabama. Laurel is a lab assistant in the Kilpatrick Morbeck lab, and Laurel is an alum of the 2022 ND. Laurel was also in the Final 4 of the College American Debate Association ADA Nationals in March this year. Dawn is a rising senior and varsity debater at Emory University, the home team. Dawn is originally from Nashville, Tennessee, and Dawn is a lab assistant for the Malson-Stupek lab. Dawn has many accomplishments in college debate. I say that because I'm his coach, but to name a few recent ones, he was a 2024 Cross-Examination Debate Association National Debate Scholar Award winner, and also in the Final 4 of the College CETA Nationals in March this year. On the negative team, oh yeah, give them a round of applause. On the negative team, we have the team of Conor and Gabriel. Give them a welcome applause. Conor is a rising sophomore and varsity debater at Emory University, also the home team. Conor's originally from Hartsdale, New York. Conor is a lab assistant for the Poole-Tillman lab. Conor's from a long line of illustrious debaters in the family. Conor's dad participated in the 1992 High School Tournament of Champions, and Conor participated in the 2023 High School Tournament of Champions. Both of them competed for Edgemont High School in New York. Conor's mom, Shannon, also attended Emory University and debated in college. Gabriel is a debate and dialogue specialist at Emory University and a debate coach at Woodward Academy in Atlanta, Georgia. Gabriel is originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Like Conor, Gabriel is also from a family of debaters because he and his identical twin, Ben, participated in high school policy debate and college policy debate. Gabriel was the 2020 top speaker at the National Debate Tournament his senior year in college. Give a round of applause again for the negative team. We'll be hearing from the affirmative team first. Laurel will be giving the 1AC.
Is everybody ready? Sounds good. Everybody ready? Fine. We'll begin now. I'll start with inherency. Existing regulations grant AI developers unlimited access to copyrighted material. New legislation is necessary to protect creators. That's ALGAR 24. AI developers justify the unlimited unauthorized use of copyrighted protected content for AI training. This provides exemption from the holder's executive right to distribute their work. The DMCA does not account for how this would threaten the stability of creative industries. The prerogative was to serve individuals, but that seems to have been lost amidst the hype of Gen AI. Putting pressure on policymakers to evaluate revised legislation and clarifying the future relationship between Gen AI and its sources. Thus, the plan. The U.S. federal government should require licensing for generative artificial intelligence that trains on copyrighted material. The first advantage is journalism. AI is an existential threat for news media. Only strengthening copyright law can save the industry. Roadpack 24. Journalists who treat the technology as an existential threat intend on using content to replace them. Gen AI companies operate this layer of content to build massive commercial businesses that directly compete and threatens the production of high-quality content. They are mashing up copies at enormous scale and speed. Tech companies threatening to deliver a killing blow if their AI companies get their way. America needs the New York Times a whole lot more than it needs ChatGPT. And otherwise, journalism will collapse, which crushes democracy and access to reliable information. That's Raz 24, who has a PhD in international relations from American University. If policymakers that must enforce their intellectual property rights and ensure that journalism have a fighting chance in the era of generative AI. The U.S. lost 2/3 of journalists. They cannot be replaced with AI. AI can go into the courtroom, or it cannot go into the courtroom and interview a defendant behind bars, cultivate the trust of whistleblower, brave the front lines of blade sport without access to human-created content. The foundational models that fuel machine learning will malfunction, degrade, collapse. The AI revolution will exacerbate the ways in which corporations are already threatening and cheapening real journalism, and journalism is particularly vulnerable. AI companies are building their systems on the wide-scale threat of IP. Journalism is an essential part of the foundational data to train AI. News makes up half of the top 10 sites. If AI companies are allowed to further cannibalize content, they will divert readers and potential subscribers away from publishers, undermining quality journalism, but also the underlying business model for the entire sector. How we decide to allocate IP will have profound ramifications. And the erosion of media makes polarization inevitable. This erodes epistemic commons and renders the societies unable to respond to existential risks. That's Schattenberger 21. Can humanity survive psychological warfare? If you're on the internet, you are in a war zone. The mind of every citizen is a target. Victories could include a delegitimized election, impositions of discourse, hatred, arms race, info wars lead to the same end as state and conventional warfare, assured destruction. Open societies under siege are becoming divided. Democratic government become impossible. People have no means of making sense of the world. It can be hard to achieve trust in governments. A downward spiral of distrust degrades decision-making and problem-solving until the entire system collapses. Society has been left teetering on the edge of mutually assured destruction. Widespread bad faith in communication media. Partitioned into propaganda levels based on information in particular media sources. Populations must find a way to set up demilitarized zones. Independently, unrestrained development of generative AI makes disinformation inevitable. That crushes global democracy. This Steiner 24, who has a PhD from Cambridge, is a senior research fellow in the politics and government team at the Overseas Development Institute, who says, disinformation is the most immediate global risk. False info and conspiracy theories are global menace. AI can supercharge this info. Generative AI enabling targeted false information, creating perfect storm. AI-generated disinfo accentuates and complicates wider challenges to citizens' trust and engagement in democratic processes. And AI-enhanced disinfo is existential. That's Cronenberg 22. Unless liberal democracies develop and counter disinformation strategies, AI-enhanced disinfo will exacerbate polarization and erode trust in institutions and blur the line between truth and lies. Disinfo operators can enable discriminatory ideas. This can widen fissures and jam the gears of governance and catalyze violence. The existential threat of AI disinfo and new capabilities increasing the volume, velocity, and virality of info. They encourage citizens to doubt the truth. The politics of eternity when malicious actors reduce life to spectacle and feeling. And democratic backsliding magnifies every existential threat. That's Diamond 19. We are now immersed in a fierce global contest of ideas, information, and norms. This is not a contest that democracies can afford to lose. If we worry about equality, governments will face more untroubled failing states. Famine and genocide are the curse of authoritarian states. State collapses the fruit of tyranny. Hard security interests are the main threats from authoritarianism. By supporting democracy, we can deny these authoritarian adversaries the geopolitical running room. No two democracies have ever gone to war with each other. And the plan solves. Requiring licensing strengthens the journalism industry and ensures people have access to accurate, reliable information. That's RAS 24. Requiring tech companies to license the use of newspapers' content would help ensure smaller, local, niche, and non-English language news publishers would be able to negotiate the use of their content. Journalism can improve the quality for the foundation models, which suffer from bias, misinfo, and spam. Newsrooms that replace journalists will hasten the ramifications for democracy. And licensing is an empirically successful strategy to strengthen the financial model of both content creators and AI companies. That's Calvert 24. Features for both journalism and Gen AI hinge on copyright law. Gen AI's LLMs are typically trained on copyrighted content. This necessitates common ground be found to ensure that AI can benefit all of humanity. New successful business strategies were built on the foundation of licensing, content rights licensing, allowed distributors to work with content creators to allow new and better consumer experiences. Gen AI model authorization was further diminishing and reinvestment in local news. The second advantage is EU relations. The EU is clamping down on US AI technology that threatens to derail US-EU cooperation, and that's COGAT 23, who's a research analyst in AI policy at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Parliament is poised to open more applications. ChatGPT is resistant to an increase in scope to raise translate tensions regarding tech regulation. Washington and Brussels focus on collaboration, broadening of the AI Act to test the spirit. U.S. companies are worried about the AI Act, fearing it will become ineffective and burdensome. The collision must be avoided. Productive dialogue remains possible and necessary. And Gen AI is coming under particular scrutiny. Italy is already banned and other countries could follow on. That's Davis 23. The Italian regulators imposed a ban on ChatGPT. Regulators follow suit. France is conducting its own inquiry. The German data commissioner said that the same action could be taken. And they're adopting a licensing-based approach to copyright. Only the plan can harmonize U.S. and EU approaches to AI regulation. That's NOACA 24. The EU seeks to ensure the ethical and human-centric development of and preventive use of practices law, which demand transparency about data use and training. 200 organizations in Europe arguing the rapid development of AI enabled by the illegal use of copyright-protected works to train the models. And U.S. action on AI regulation is necessary to improve relations and set global standards on technology. That's Dave 23. U.S. unproductive lawmakers and business-friendly courts have outsourced regulation to the EU. The U.S. and the EU have capacity to place an international standard, but if the EU's forthcoming AI Act isn't matched, it will be more difficult to change how the industry operates. If you're doing that alone, that takes time and it slowly spreads. When we're action together, it will be easier. Otherwise, differing standards will take the transatlantic relations. That's Spring 21. Technology has become an area that creates conflict. Europeans have begun to reach for other democratic allies. European campaigners believe U.S. tech giants are forces to protect against efforts to build up digital sovereignty, impede transatlantic cooperation. The EU's effort to strengthen ethical AI, creating problems for cooperation. Europeans express skepticism about the extent to which Europe and the U.S. are aligned on AI ethical principles. And U.S.-EU relations have a litany of existential threats, specifically nuclear non-proliferation and climate change. That's Eisenstadt 23. The challenge we face, the existential threat of climate change, transformational technologies like artificial intelligence, looming nuclear threats from Iran and North Korea, demand greater U.S.-EU cooperation than ever before. Precedent's ability to new relations are plentiful. The U.S. and EU would work together to impose on Russia the stiffest economic sanctions ever. The U.S. is the EU's largest bilateral trade and investment partner. And EU climate leadership solves global wars. That's Ischinger 20, the chair of the Munich Global Security Conference, former deputy minister of Germany, who says climate poses a mass security threat. 24.9 million people displaced. The climate impacts undermine peace, conflict in states rise, exacerbate resource scarcity, and contested in the Arctic. Climate change will become the most dominant threat. Reducing GHGs is the most effective action. International efforts are being undermined, given weight EU states that have a particularly important role to play. I'm open for cross.
Okay. You good?
Yep.
Okay, let's start with the journalism advantage. The first piece of evidence, the 1AC Ratchet evidence, says that AI is not going to be able to replace journalists because journalists can't go into the courtroom, they can't interview whistleblowers, stuff like that. If that is true, why is generative AI a threat to journalism?
Yeah, so we think it happens in a couple of ways. First, we argue that because companies are profit-seeking, they're not going to be willing to pay journalists when they can just pay for an AI summary. Secondarily, we argue that journalist companies and independent journalists lose money when audiences realize they don't have to pay $100 for an NYT subscription anymore, when they can just go to AI and do that instead.
Yeah, fair enough. So the most 1AC evidence is about big journalists like the New York Times. The last two cards in the journalism advantage seem to make the point that local news is something that's really important in smaller news companies. What does the plan do for those local news companies who don't have an active lawsuit open against like OpenAI?
Yeah, so we argue that even though they don't have an active lawsuit against OpenAI, it takes federal action to protect these people in the future. If they're still at risk of AI, it's still a pressing issue.
Yeah, sure, okay. So the 1AC Morbeck evidence, that's the first card in journalism. It's from a staff writer from a website called Gizmodo. They obviously have an incentive to protect their industry, which is the journalism industry. Why should we trust this author?
Yeah, so I don't think just because he's a journalist means he has like the necessary I don't know, prerogative to like always defend his own, I don't know, industry. We think that the Gizmodo staff writer is going to be like very non-biased when reporting information, and it's also corroborated by every single other 1AC author. So we think we think he's a little
fair enough. Last question on journalism: why does generative AI in the U.S. affect democracy globally?
Yeah, so we think that the U.S. is like kind of the staple for democracy globally, and we think allowing the U.S. democracy to backslide because of like AI-enhanced disinfo, it's gonna like spread to other countries and magnify like the U.S.'s ability to tackle existential threats.
Okay, fair enough. Let's go to the EU advantage. So this impact card, the Eisenstadt evidence, it says that the EU and US want to work together on climate change and nuclear issues. Why would they stop doing that? Because of disputes over AI?
Yeah, so we think that continuing to erode the relationship makes the EU and US like less effective at working together. The less they work together like consistently, the less likely they are to work together in the future.
Okay, so follow-up question, what are the US and EU currently doing about climate change now? Or like what would they do in the AF world?
What would they do in the AF world? Yeah, they can look to increasing investments on like green energy technology. They can look together to like regulating certain oil industries. They can look together on like increasing sanctions on countries that aren't very climate friendly, etc.
Okay, fair enough. Last question, so your second advantage seems to be about the EU AI Act. That's a really comprehensive piece of legislation that involves regulations on privacy, a bunch of other stuff. Why is generative AI necessary to align the US with this broader piece of legislation?
Yeah, so a huge part of like the AI Act was about licensing and like, you know, providing protection for people that AI steals their content.
Okay.
All right, between each of the speeches, I'll be offering some questions or time for comments or questions from the audience. So some things that I want to point out about Laurel's speech that went very well include you could always tell when Laurel was reading evidence text versus the tagline summary and the author's name and date and sometimes their qualifications before. Hopefully that was also clear for you all. There were a few authors where she would really showcase and highlight these authors are very credentialed compared to some of the others. Like she didn't read the credentials for every single author in the 1AC, but the ones that were especially qualified were read, and that's really useful, and that sometimes that can result in improving your speaker points when you do that. There was a really good and easy transition between the journalism and the EU advantage, and there was time when everyone could shift their piece of paper to the next piece of paper. So it was very clear when the journalism advantage started and ended, and when the EU advantage started and also ended. And when inherency, piece of evidence, and plan text was read, and when journalism started. Make sure if you haven't already to write journalism advantage somewhere at the top or bottom of the page for that, and EU advantage somewhere at the top or bottom of your page so that later you don't get confused, and later when there are more, like 4 pieces of paper involved in the debate, you'll easily be able to put them in the correct order when people give a roadmap later for some of their speeches. Is there anything that anyone noticed about this 1AC evidence that is different from the 1AC evidence in the camp packet? For example, was anything missing that you might have talked about in your labs that's part of the 1AC that was not in this speech? Yeah.
The second advantage is about creativity.
Yeah, so the creativity advantage is also available for use in your practice debates over this weekend and in the camp tournament, but that was not present in this debate. Did anyone notice anything different about the EU advantage that you learned about versus what was in this 1AC speech? Give you a minute to think about it. Was there as much evidence read on the EU advantage as was available in the camp packet? Right, so something was taken out of there, and you might have noticed that some of the evidence about why nuclear proliferation would cause extinction or very large wars, that was not part of this 1AC. So we'll see if Don talks about that in his 2AC, but so far that is not part of this debate, even though you can read that in your practice debates or the camp tournament. So for the cross-ex of the 2NC speaker decided to cross-ex the 1AC, that's very normal for that speaker alone rather than both Conor and Gabriel to participate in the cross-examination. Tag team is often for WWE, not debate. so they did not do tag team even though it's a demolition debate. Conor needed to prepare his 1NC and make sure everything was finalized and in order, so he did not participate, which was appropriate. So Gabriel conducted the whole cross-examination and asked the questions himself. I liked that he immediately stood up when the timer ended for the 1AC. He had a first question, and it did not take him long to ask that first question. It sounded like he had prepared some questions as Laurel was giving the 1AC rather than wing it. And another thing I liked about Gabe's cross-ex is that the questions were all really evidence-driven. He asked about specific pieces of evidence, sometimes by name, sometimes asked about particular lines or text within the evidence that shows and demonstrates he was really listening, or he had really read, perhaps he had even researched and created the ND affirmative and case negative, which he did, had the luxury of doing that for our camp. But overall, the questions that he asked were not really clarification questions, such as, did you read the proliferation impact, or what was the impact to the journalism advantage? What is the result of if we lose democracy, or any question like that? All the questions instead were in hopes to set up some on-case arguments that likely will be a big part of Conor's 1NC speech. All right. Now I think we're ready to hear the 1NC speech.
Okay, it's two off, the journalism advantage, and then the EU advantage. First off is the industry DA. Uniqueness. The US is ahead of China in the tech race thanks to their lead in generative AI, Gordon 23. Whichever country wins the AI race could corner the global economy. Between Beijing that wants to mold global interest and Washington determined to keep Chinese tech behind, China is scrambling to fill the gap. Biden is eager to preserve and widen that lead. Officials lobbied against any US regulation of AI. It would slow domestic innovation, opening authoritarian China AI. Link. The plan makes training generative AI prohibitively expensive, which collapses the industry. Andreessen Horowitz 23. Generative AI requires enormous training but also immense content. The cost of paying to license would be prohibitive for AI developers. This would undermine competition by startups, the source of the greatest innovation. Developers liable for hundreds of billions in payment, discouraging investment that drive US innovation. The best way to lose leadership is by rushing to pass legislation that undermines copyright that made the country a technological leader. Impact. Chinese tech dominance causes extinction from emerging tech in global war. J19. System must deal with emerging and disruptive technology. Innovations promise great benefits but carry serious downside risks. AI generating new security challenges. Autonomous weapons turn on their creators, resulting in human extinction. Technologies balance great potential upside with great downside risk. Spurring arms race and weapon proliferation. Undermining global strategic stability, the greatest risk to global strategic stability from new tech comes from the risk revisionist autocracies may win the new tech arms race. If China succeeds mastering tech before a democratic core, this could lead to a drastic and rapid shift in the balance of power. Next off is the Farm Bill. Uniqueness. The Farm Bill is heading towards passage now, but it will require bipartisan compromise. Civac 526. Final fights over the Farm Bill. Fights over conservation for certain commodities have also delayed legislation. It is still possible to get a deal done. Dynamics are complex and largely bipartisan. Legislation reflects a careful balancing of interests. Predicted Republicans will have to abandon changes if they want to get the bill done. Republicans celebrated committee passage as a sign of momentum. 4 Democrats crossed over to vote in favor. There is a good chance a compromise can still come together. Wide areas for agreement. Link. Changing AI copyright law is politically toxic in Congress, especially in an election year. Levy 24. Dreams of a sweeping AI bill are doomed. Congress can hardly keep the government afloat. Prospects of both houses juggling in an election year is remote. The U.S. Congress does have legislation pending. The puzzle is that no one knows whether using copyright work is legal. It is exactly the kind of decision lawmakers attempt to avoid. Libya didn't stop the government single-handedly. It's already hit the brakes. Internally, the Farm Bill is key to global food security. Miller and Milken, 24. Farm Bill responsible for funding international food aid assists war-torn countries combat rising hunger. Farm Bill necessary to combat malnutrition. Over 700 million people face chronic hunger worldwide. Grows almost daily because of global instability and climate emergencies. We need robust and decisive action, committed funding from every country. U.S. should be leading the way. Impact. Food insecurity goes nuclear. Crib 22. Humans have fought over food for 20,000 years. Food and land scarcity are primary drivers in modern conflict. People seem to have forgotten that German aim was to take farmland from the Soviets. Controlling Ukraine's food bowl is among Putin's main goals. Spreading hunger in turn snowballs government failures, civil wars, and refugee tsunamis. 9 regions at high risk of food failure and conflict, ranging from riots to nuclear war. Food and war is inexorable. Go to case on the journalism advantage. 1. Copyright reforms alone fail to protect creators. Brown and Agarwal, 23. Crisis in news sustainability continues to be a global problem. Copyright-centric approaches are not a silver bullet. There's no one-size-fits-all to this problem. Copyright will likely need to be combined with other policy solutions, such as transparency and antitrust, to be effective. 2. Turn. The plan's weakening of fair use undermines democracy. Edwards, 24. Fair use is used every day by journalists. We ingest data and we put it out in a different way. Concerns about privacy and freedom being curtailed by limiting fair use. Democracy was better served because journalists could read each other and use each other's information. 3. Licensing sets a dangerous precedent that limits fair use, that spills over to undermine news media. Jarvis, 24. The industry took as gospel AI companies should have to license and pay. If AI creators would license everything that grants them lesser rights than media, any use required licensing sets a dangerous precedent for news media itself. If licensing and payment is required, the doctrine of fair use could be eviscerated. 4. Wall Street is destroying newspapers, not technology. Schaefer, 24. At every newspaper, hard times reduced page counts, eliminated news feeds, and resulted in layoffs. Papers purchased and squeezed by private equity firms, percentage of owned by private equity rose to 23%. New owners have turned their backs on democracy. Executives pressured by private equity investors, mergers and acquisition, face the digital future. Banks left papers hamstrung and in debt for billions. Firms profited off bankruptcies or debt financing. 5. No internal link between AI and journalism collapse. Generative AI still needs journalists for learning models, and journalists will still exist for whistleblowing, interviews, and testimony. 6. Global democracy is resilient. Overcame COVID, Myanmar, and Afghanistan. Idea 21. 2020 has seen pandemic. Stability has been disrupted. All nations are struggling to adjust. COVID has exacerbated increasing authoritarianism across the globe. Myanmar fell victim to a military coup. The greatest blow was the fall of the People's Government in Afghanistan. Countries come together to fight disease and ushered in a period of unprecedented global cooperation. Popular protests for better government in Sudan and Chile led to reforms, representing the victory of democratic institutions over government pressures. The urge for democratic governance remains strong. 7. No impact to disinformation. People don't base decisions off of news. Lytle, 24. Misinformation prevalence and impact are overstated. Many think misinformation is very prevalent. Empirical work has shown this is wrong. Misinformation represents a minute portion of media. Most people aren't interested. People are savvy information consumers and tend to be skeptical of reliable information. Mass media has a small effect on behaviors. Journalists overemphasize the threat. The more we research, we realize the problem is smaller than we would have thought. We shouldn't assume information pollution has strong effects. Go to the EU advantage. 1. US-EU cooperation on AI is high now. Leiden, 24. EU and US agreed to increase cooperation in AI, agreed to minimize divergence, sketch out area of existing collaboration, important step in helping develop guardrails and frameworks between the EU and US, avoid creating silos and friction. This will continue at a wider international level. 2. Cooperation is tanked in other areas. Divergence in climate policy, NATO fracturing, and military spending prove even if AI spills over, there are other issues which prohibit further cooperation. 3. The EU is obsolete and useless. Sched 12. The EU is in absolute demographic, economic, and tech decline. Its major policies have failed in foreign and security policies. It is an international joke. It spends nothing on defense. In Libya, where Europe took the lead, they were entirely dependent on US logistics and supplies. EU soft power is because it has no choice. Expensive but ineffective, EU institutions are anti-democratic. The parliament is glorified debating society. Elites are failing. In disparate economies where changes of interest and exchange rates are forbidden, weaker economies have no means of competing. 4. US-EU cooperation is not the key to solve their impacts. Their Eisenstadt 23 card has 0 warrants for how transatlantic relations help reduce the risk of existential challenges. And 5. US-EU cooperation over climate change is unprecedentedly high. Pycone, 22. US-EU TTC issued a joint statement that outlines progress as well as future plans for cooperation on supply chains, tech standards, export controls, climate, and trade practices. Participants committed to bilateral trade and investment, establish mechanism to encourage standardization. Parties intend to take a leading role, support climate and environmental policy goals, promoting green public policies, methodologies, calculating carbon footprint, and advancing joint US-EU initiative, incorporating sustainability, intend to develop a warning system for semiconductor disruptions, plan multilateral initiatives, address rare earth elements. I'm open for problems. Yep, I'm good.
Okay. I'm going to start on the Edwards 24 card.
Hey.
So Edwards 24 seems to be citing Jarvis. So Edwards 24 is citing Jarvis, who works for an AI company and like invests a ton in AI. What qualifications does Edwards 24 have to actually be like talking about AI?
Sure. So first of all, Edwards definitely knows the industry very well. He made that explicitly clear. So they have a front view of what's going on in the industry and how the incorporation of copyright would undermine fair use writ large. So he cites history, and I think like the warrants of the card are indisputable. So when
He cites history where? Sorry to interrupt.
sure. So Jarvis talks about how we attempted to stop radio with copyright, we attempted to stop TV, and both of those things have been good for democracy and helped spread information widely. And AI is probably the next step in that chain. So when we regulate AI, we undermine copyright. I don't know if that's like a direct answer to the credentials, but I think he provides very strong insights into the industry.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, I'm going to move on to the Farm Bill.
Yeah.
So the linked debate, so that's the Levy 24 card. Levy 24 card seems to say Congress just like isn't interested in regulating AI. Why does that suggest that it's like politically toxic and the app will collapse the chances of the Farm Bill?
Sure. So one, the Levy 24 card makes the claim that there's lots of legislation pending in Congress. So currently it's booked and it's very tense there. Second, Congress has explicitly made clear they don't want to pass regulation because it's difficult to deal with. So no one really knows the rules and regulations, and as a result, there's going to be immense debate over passing something so sweeping as the plan. So they've made zero attempts because they don't know the legality and they don't want to like step over these issues.
Okay, I'll move on to the internal link here. The Miller and Milken 24 card seems to suggest that there's already like millions and millions of people struggling from food insecurity. Your next card says food insecurity goes nuclear. At what point does food insecurity cause nuclear war if it already exists?
Sure. So I think the U.S. is a linchpin in the global food supply. We provide a massive amount of food across the globe. Miller and Milken is super great on how we deliver international aid to struggling countries. And as a result, if the U.S. falls from that chain, I think we would reach the threshold that Crib talks about.
Okay, so we're already a leader in food security without having passed the Farm Bill. Why is the Farm Bill key?
Yeah. So the past Farm Bill expired, but we still have measures from it extending all the way, I think, to September when we have to pass the new one. So we're still like actively a leader, but once we cut the subsidies the Farm Bill provides and other positive incentives that the Farm Bill provides, we will fall behind as a agricultural country.
Okay, I'll move on. Response number 3 on the EU advantage is the Sketch-Bell card. Sked criticizes the EU for not investing in like defense. Why does like the EU's lack of a military like footing suggest failures on regulations of AI?
Sure. So I think the Sked card is specifically about like your EU-US cooperation. We think that the EU is a useless partner for cooperation. I don't think it provides anything because it's seen internationally as a joke. They are seen as militarily weak, they're seen as ineffective, and they haven't been able to do most of their domestic policy goals due to their decline.
Some really good things I want to point out about that 1NC, and then I'll have some questions for you all, is one really good thing was the roadmap before the time of the speech really started. Conor said it will be 2 off case, then the journalism advantage, then the EU advantage. And Conor didn't name or like spoil what those off cases were in the roadmap before the speech started, even though we kind of know it's probably going to be the Farm Bill and the Industry DA, because that's what's available to us in the camp packet at the moment. But he was able to say 2 off case to keep the element of surprise, then organize your flows with the journalism advantage and then the EU advantage. Conor had a great pause between each of the pages so that the audience, you all are the judges in this debate, could get their paper in order and switched, and also write down the tagline for the argument for the very next page. So Conor had to look up a bit at you all, the judges, to see that you are ready. Otherwise, if he switched too quickly from, say, the industry DA to Farm Bill, without letting you adjust your papers, then you all would probably miss the tagline for that first uniqueness card on the Farm Bill about why the Farm Bill will pass. Or between the transition from Farm Bill to journalism, if he hadn't allowed that pause and pen time, then you probably would have missed the first argument on the journalism advantage. And Conor didn't want you to miss any of his arguments because he thinks they're all very good, so that pen time was really important. It was really clear in Conor's speaking style, very clear what was evidence, what was text of the evidence, what was an analytic argument. By analytic argument, I just mean an argument that did not have evidence support to go along with it. He created a numbering scheme for the on-case arguments on each of the advantages. You all should add those numbers too if you did not add them on the journalism and the EU advantage, because it will become really relevant in both the 2AC and the 2NC speech that come next. Okay, a question for you. What are the negative team's 3 forms of offense that they have in this debate? At this point in the debate, they've got 3 pieces of offense. What is one of them? Yes.
Face turn on the journalism advantage.
Good. That second argument on the journalism advantage about democracy was called a turn. So in the 1AC, Laurel said the AF plan and the AF, they think they help solve democracy and prevent democratic backsliding that would cause war. But Conor has suggested that the plan actually harms democracy. So they're attempting to turn the advantage on the journalism advantage. That's one piece of offense. What's a second form?
No impact on the EU.
Only we're talking about offense.
Okay.
So that one is an argument the 1NC made, but that's a form of case defense. So what are someone else try. What's another form of offense? Yes, you answered for both the second and third form of offense. One is the industry DA and one is the Farm Bill DA. Good. Also about Conor's speech, it sounded like Conor had read this evidence before or did a speaking drill this morning because he was loud, he was clear, and he was not stumbling around with the author names or the text of the evidence, the quoted parts that we've underlined and highlighted. So for the cross-ex of this 1NC, it was again very normal that only Laurel was asking questions during this cross-ex because Dawn needed to use that time to prepare the immediate next speech, the 2AC. So it wasn't that Dawn didn't have any questions or didn't have qualms about what Conor was saying at all. In fact, he will have many that he'll bring up in his next speech, but he needed to continue to finalize his thoughts and what pieces of evidence his 2AC will make use of, so only Laurel was participating in this one. A great thing by both teams was that both had their own timer going. So Laurel had a timer going, Conor also had a timer going in this cross-ex. Conor was 94% of the time looking at you all, the audience, because you are the judges. That's like sort of weird in policy debate that you typically in your everyday life, you want to look into the eyes of the person that you're talking to. But in this case, instead of looking at Laurel most of the time, even though she's the one asking questions of him, he is actually looking at the judges. Why would he do that? It's not to be rude. What would be a strategic reason? Yes.
So you're only trying to convince the judge here?
Yeah, so he doesn't care if Laurel gets upset or is pleased with his answers. He cares about what you all look like, whether you're following, whether you look confused, whether you look tired, whether you look like you can't hear him, whether you're nodding along in agreement of things that he's saying, so then he knows if he'll need to continue his answer or reverse course and switch to a different answer, or any feedback that you give him with your facial expressions is really helpful for him. That's why Conor was looking at you all when he was answering the questions, and that's very normal, and that's what you all should also practice doing in your debates. Laurel's first question in the cross-ex was really good. It was very evidence-driven, and it was very clear also where that question was going. And it's about an important issue we established was offense. That Edwards evidence that she asked about is the evidence associated with the democracy turn on the journalism advantage, and whether the plan improves or harms democracy could, we don't know the future, but could ultimately become the issue that the judges decide the round on. If the affirmative wins that issue, they will likely have an easy time winning that advantage, and potentially that advantage could outweigh one of the disadvantages. One of the questions Laurel asked, or some of the other questions she asked about, were related to the Farm Bill, and some of them attacked the internal link of the Farm Bill, such as whether or not food insecurity will actually create the conditions for a nuclear war. And that question, I imagine, was asked because that's one of the parts of this disadvantage that Laurel and Dawn do not think to be the strongest part of this disadvantage, compared to the uniqueness argument that the Farm Bill is or is not likely to pass. So it was good that those questions were asked to really think about the quality of that evidence, but also the logic of that claim. All right, now we're ready to hear from the 2AC, who will start to defend against the attacks the 1NC made.
Good morning, everybody. The order for the 2AC is going to be the journalism advantage, the EU advantage, the Farm Bill disadvantage, and the AI industry disadvantage. So I'll give that one more time. It's journalism, so the journalism advantage, the EU advantage, the Farm Bill disadvantage, and then the AI industry disadvantage. All good? You all good? Fantastic. Unrestrained generative AI causes extinction. It waters down the quality of journalism and increases disinformation, which collapses trust in governance and democracy, both of which increase wars and make responding to crisis impossible. That's Hunningberg, Diamond, and Schmattenberger. Licensing solves by creating a legal pathway to restrict AI and keep journalistic quality. Now, the line by line. 1NC1, they say copyright alone fails, but licensing is key because it has empirically given journalism companies room to grow and distribute while preventing unauthorized use of their content. That was 1AC Calvert. And 1NC2, they say weakening fair use is bad for democracy, but the affirmative does not collapse fair use and instead creates a legal pathway to prevent AI from spiraling out of control while maintaining journalism, which will collapse with unrestrained AI. That's 1AC Ropek. And 1NC3, they say licensing sets a dangerous precedent, but licensing increases access and innovation in news by ensuring small, local, niche, and non-English publishers can negotiate for their content while decreasing bias. That's 1AC Ratch. And 1NC4, they say Wall Street is worse, but Wall Street sets a brink with it weakening only some companies. AI will wipe out the industry by replacing the bottom foundational jobs through low-quality spam. That's 1AC Ratch. And 1NC5, they say no internal link between AI and journalism collapse, but yes internal link. Generative AI will cannibalize journalists by diverting interest and funding, which hollows the industry out from the inside. AI not being able to do whistleblowing, interviews, or testimony in person is our argument because those companies will always prefer the cheap AI over the expensive people. That's 1AC Ratch. And 1NC6, they say democracy is resilient, but AI disinformation campaigns collapse trust in government and disincentivizes engagement in democratic processes, making democracy and its institutions useless. That was 1AC Hunningberg. And democratic backsliding spurs existential interstate conflict since democracy provides resilient checks on escalation and tyranny. That's 1AC Diamond. And 1NC7, they say no impact to disinformation, but yes impact. It collapses journalism by lowering quality and flooding the market with propaganda and bad faith, causing polarization and making responding to existential crises like war collectively impossible. That's one in T. Schmattenberger. Now, the EU relations advantage. Lagging US AI regulations disrupts harmonization with Europe. That tanks US-EU relations, which are key to solve international cooperation on existential climate change. That's Eisenstadt. Only the plan regulates aligning both parties. That was the 1AC solvency evidence. Now, the line by line, 1C1. They said cooperation is high now, but their evidence simply said both parties agreed to cooperation, not that there is policy harmonization. That is key because the EU prioritizes digital sovereignty and will not wait on allies forever due to strong AI ethics principles. That's the 1AC Frank evidence. And 1C2, they said cooperation has tanked, but climate, NATO, and the military are already regulated industries, while AI is a brand new and unregulated mess, meaning it is disruptive and a potential friction point for future cooperation, especially when integrating AI into climate response and the military. Only the US and EU acting sets a global standard. That's the 1AC Dave evidence. And 1NC3, they said the EU is obsolete, but their evidence is only talking about domestic hurdles, not about our scenario, where the EU is a necessary great power for international negotiation on climate change response. That's Eisenstadt. And 1NC4, they said cooperation is not key, but the US and EU are strong bilateral trade partners and trendsetters, while also having a precedent of setting norms on international issues like economic sanctions on Russia. Only continued smooth cooperation maximizes the US-EU strength for climate cooperation. That's Eisenstadt. 1C5, they said the US and EU already cooperate on climate, but their evidence assumes coordination on future plans only after legislation, since the status quo is disharmonized. Those future plans become derailed as well due to European prioritization of digital sovereignty. That's the Frank evidence. Now, the Farm Bill disadvantage. Case outweighs the disad. US-EU climate leadership outweighs on magnitude because it checks against climate change's destruction of food security and feedback loops that cause ocean acidification and resource wars. That's the 1AC Ischinger evidence. And 2, non-unique. This little piggy is not going to the market. That means the Farm Bill is stuck in the mud due to fights like SNAP payments. That's Winters 528. The Farm Bill opposition from most Dems about SNAP could stall advancement. Tepid Dem support is not enough to see final passage. It needs major changes. It does not have support in the Senate or White House. Everyone knows this would never be law. The Senate and administration won't accept it. It does not have votes to pass the House. It is not clear lawmakers will make that deadline, especially as attention turns to election. And 3, no link. Their levy evidence simply states Congress does not want to do their job on AI, not passing the affirmative, damaging the Farm Bill. And 4, no internal link. Mom says we have food at home. No Farm Bill needed. That's to Chile 23. Subsidies are unnecessary. Australia and New Zealand eliminated ag supports years ago and remain major producers. Farmers adapt and innovate. Today, the farm sector is thriving and more diverse. And 5, no impact. There is no war from food. Global food security is resilient. That's from 22. The world is much more resilient to food. Live in an age of food abundance. Characterize the food outlook for Egypt as serious but not critical. Where famine does threaten, the international community can save lives. Ukraine does not make feeding Afghanistan's population easier. It is only a very incidental aggravating factor. African agriculture can be extended as well as intensified. Stress is not a crisis. Crisis does not have to be a catastrophe. Now, the AI industry advantage, or disadvantage. 1, case outweighs the disad. Backsliding US and global democracy due to collapses in journalism outweigh on magnitude because it increases Chinese dominance across all sectors, including tech and norm setting. That's 1AC Diamond. And 2, non-unique. The US is already behind China on AI. That's Lovelace 24. China has caught up in the AI race and even pulled ahead. Experts cautioned against overestimating America's advantage. China surpassed America in several areas. The CCP is making advancements to catch up on generative AI in a new AI model developed as the best-in-class open-source model. The US could fall behind if it fails to invest in evaluation frameworks for responsible AI. To win, the US needs a wider range of tools than LLMs. We have got to get AI in the military. That's China's goal. And 3, no link. Their Horowitz evidence is a capital marketing firm begging Congress to not tax them more, not because they are interested in the industry growing at large. Instead, prefer the 1AC Calvert evidence, which says licensing is key to increasing reinvestment for AI. And 4, link turn. A, legal uncertainty will sink the AI industry without clarity on copyright law. That's SASBO 24. AI is headed toward a litigation iceberg which could sink this tech. A settlement of billions could stifle the entire AI industry. The threat of legal costs create a chilling effect, deterring innovation. The courts need to affirm AI is transformative, not subject to copyright complaints. Affirmation is crucial to protect innovation from being overwhelmed by legal challenges and allow new competitors, but also to ensure tech continues to benefit society without guidance. We risk legal uncertainty and fear. And B, but licensing can save the industry from being destroyed by copyright infringement lawsuits. That's Nunwick 24. Training has been central to lawsuits. Licensing can only be positive for the future of AI ethics. Access to high-quality articles will ensure bots are trained on reliable sources. Partnerships will reduce lawsuits and friction. Tech insiders believe licensing could save it from future copyright lawsuits. Data is increasingly vital, highlighting transparency where an AI originates in a reliable way. And 5, there's no link. The plan will undermine profitability. Mark that as an analytic.
Coming for cross.
Ready when you are.
Let's start on the tech. This ad, Lovelace 24 doesn't specify where China is ahead of the US. How can we take this as indicative of China's stomping the US in the tech race?
A couple of things. The Lovelace evidence is citing a number of artificial intelligence specialists who have previously warned the Department of Defense. And so it is important to note that these specialists are saying, hey, China is ahead in the tech race. We are either going to fall massively behind, or we need to set up regulations so we can integrate AI into the military.
Sure, that's fine. The CISPO 24 card, it mentions multiple lawsuits in the status quo. Why does the SQO not disprove the link turn?
Okay, this is very important. The last 2 paragraphs of the CISPO evidence say that there are current lawsuits, but ambiguity means that there must be policy or court affirmation to say what is fair use and what isn't fair use. The ambiguity is what kills the industry because it means that AI innovators will be afraid to go and get lawsuits, especially small creators, and for the big creators, that risks massive, massive damage to the journalism industry.
Sure. Your card talks about Sarah Silverman suing Meta and getting pretty unanimously destroyed by the court. Why does that not set a legal precedent? Or should
A couple of things. One, the evidence specifically says that we need to focus on both the Silverman case and the New York Times case. The New York Times case being arguably more important because it sets a threshold for generative AI in journalism, not just the Silverman books. Second, it specifically says that there is still legal uncertainty and fear over what is and isn't allowed for AI to use when generating their databases, and so we need legal precedent based off of policy action in order to do that.
Yeah, sure. Let's go to the Farm Bill this ad.
Yes.
The 2.23 card talks about New Zealand abolishing subsidies. How is that an appropriate model for U.S. agriculture?
Well, a couple of things. One, Australia and New Zealand, so there's more than just one example. The empirical evidence seems to indicate that we do not need massive agriculture subsidies in order for people to be able to eat, right? We have massive farms. We do not need to give them a ton of money. Second, the evidence also says that our farm sector is thriving today, even without massive, massive subsidies that you are calling for in the Farm Bill list.
Sure, that's fine. On the uniqueness evidence, our scenario is about a rewritten bill, and this seems pretty indicative of the status quo's version. Why will there not be time to rewrite a new version of the Farm Bill?
Yes, absolutely. So first, Congress is notoriously slow, and that's important because the last section of the card says the deadline is September. Why would we focus on a farm bill when the 2024 presidential election is right around the corner? People are going to be shifting, especially politicians, shifting to the election and not the farm bill, which means we need to focus on what kind of issues are going to come up between them. Second, the evidence indicates that there are other issues, not the affirmative, but things like SNAP negotiation, that are built into the bill, and so they don't even know what the new bill will look like.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we just finished the 2AC, some really good things that were going on in Don's speech. One, he had both his computer up and his flows up with him at the same time because he was going to read some new evidence, so he needed the computer to be up there with him but he also had his flows up there to help keep him accountable to not drop any of the 1NC case arguments especially. He had a really good record of the 1NC arguments and that numbering system that Conor started, so that he made sure that he was able to say, they said, and summarize their argument well, and even by number say, so that he went in order of what Conor made arguments in, and then he was able to also extend his 1AC evidence, which would also appear on the same flow, as well as make any new type of response that he wanted to. The argument that Don made on the Farm Bill DA, that there won't be war from food, that the world is resilient, that's an argument that he knew he wanted to make. So I imagine that also he and Laurel had a conversation before Laurel's cross-ex, because Laurel had set up that argument with the cross-ex question about why food insecurity would really create the conditions for a global war. So she asked that question, and that easily helped set up Don's ability to make that argument in the actual speech. So now it's in the record. The judge has that argument on their flow and a piece of evidence associated with it, which was really good and shows how there's a progression of arguments from a cross-examination into a speech. So that cross-ex question was very relevant to their strategy. A question for you all. Don said a few sentences on each case advantage, and then a bit later said the phrase, now to the line by line. What was the first few sentences before the line by line called? Yeah.
Is that the overview?
Yeah. So sometimes there are overviews that happen on the off case positions, like a disadvantage that the negative block might have, but sometimes the affirmative team will also have an overview on the case. So for each of their advantages, it's likely that sometimes the affirmative has an overview. That's why Alicia suggested leaving some space at the top of your flows on all of the pages, just in case the affirmative team had an overview or the negative team had an overview. So what do we think the purpose of the on-case overview that Don had was? What was he trying to do there? Yeah.
He's trying to paint the picture of like what the two sides are and kind of set up the argument.
Partially, yeah. He's definitely trying to paint a picture of his own side of the arguments, not really starting to compare his own impacts versus the other teams so much, but really try to establish his own impacts on each of those advantages are very large, and as a secondary concern, that the affirmatives plan would resolve that very big impact. So both, the purpose was just a couple sentences, it's not very long, but he wanted to make sure he extended the terminal impact, the really big consequence of each advantage, and then also a reason why the affirmatives plan would solve. And also pick some pieces of 1AC evidence that would support that too, to remind the judge. Okay, did Don read any new evidence on the journalism or EU advantage in the 2AC? What do we think? Yeah, so Don did not choose to read new evidence on the journalism advantage or on the EU advantage in the 2AC. Instead, he was relying on how good the quality of evidence in the 1AC that Laurel read was already good enough to anticipate and respond to those 1NC arguments, which is a fine choice and is pretty common when there is no offense on the case advantages to not read any and not commit to read new evidence in the 2AC on the advantages. He read a bunch of new evidence on the disadvantages because the 1AC evidence, most of it was not meant to anticipate or respond to those disadvantages, so he needed to make some new evidence and make some new arguments. Okay, about journalism and EU again. Did Don choose to extend both of those advantages, or did he get rid of one?
He extended both.
Good, yeah. He's decided that he wants to keep both of those advantages in play at this time in the debate. That could change in the rebuttal speeches, or they could choose to keep both advantages still in play. What about the creativity advantage? Was that introduced in this debate in the 2AC? Right, no, it was not. So there were no new advantages added to the affirmative case that we know of, but also none that were in the 1AC have been removed yet either. What kind of offense did Don read on the industry DA? For example, did he impact turn or did he link turn the disadvantage?
He link turned it.
Oh, I was calling on the person behind you, but I bet they agreed. So they link turned the industry DA. They did not attempt to initiate an impact turn on that disadvantage that we know of, but there was a link turn in play. So that argument may become important later in the rebuttal speeches for the affirmative team should they decide to advance it. For the cross-ex of the 2AC, again, it was super normal that only Conor is participating in asking questions because Gabriel needed to finalize his arguments for the 2NC speech based on what Don just said in his speech, and Gabe needed to do other things like save his speech document, make sure that all his evidence is highlighted that he's choosing to read in this speech. So Conor is taking the lead and being the only person participating. Both Conor and Don appear to know the evidence very well to be able to apply the evidence that both their teams have read so far in the debate towards a question or towards an answer. I really liked that when Conor asked a question, he would use the evidence author name, even when it was Don's evidence that we're talking about. Because too often we will all watch debates where a person will ask a question simply as your evidence says this and then ask their question, and then the opponent will say, which evidence of mine are you talking about? Or where do you think I read that? And then they will need to locate the evidence and have it open to reference, which can waste a lot of time when you only have 3 minutes for both the questions and the answers in any given period. So it's really good if you want to have an evidence-driven cross-ex that you, whether it's your evidence or your opponent's evidence, you ask about it by the author's name so that everybody's on the same page. And if you do need to pull it up to look at it because you haven't had much time looking at it, then you can locate it quickly because you have the author's name because it was in the question. Also, both sides were very respectful to each other in this cross-ex, even though they had serious disagreements about whose evidence was better on some of these issues. So the cross-ex was not heated, and that's not just because Conor and Don are teammates, but because they want to conduct themselves in ways that are not hostile towards their opponent in these debates, even though both of them, their life depends on them winning this debate, and they really care about that. They do want to also maintain a respectful atmosphere, and they know that not all judges respond positively when the debate gets too heated. They both seem passionate about their arguments, and they both seem passionate that they're right and confident about the quality of their evidence and the quality of their answers, but they were still simultaneously very respectful to one another. All right, now we will be hearing from the 2NC speech, the beginning of the negative block.
Good. It's been a minute. Okay. The order is going to be the journalism advantage. And then the EU relations advantage. Okay. Everyone's good? Yes. Everybody good? Cool. Start Starting on journalism, extend 1 and C1. Copyright reforms fail. The thesis of their advantage is that news companies will be pushed around by big AI corporations. However, that is inevitable absent reforms to antitrust because tech companies will continue making more and more money that they will use to boss around small news companies. They say that licensing empirically works. What empirics? The best example for this licensing model is the music industry, but licensing has been a disaster for musicians. Musicians make pennies on the dollar while companies like Spotify make a ton of money on the work that they produce. This is empirically true given how big they have said that the global news crisis is. The plan is insufficient to stem the tide of the decline of news, which is our Brown and Agrawal evidence. Next, licensing can't generate fair deals for publishers. Brown and Agrawal 23. Focusing on enhancing news publishers' protections does not by itself enable them to obtain better deals from digital platforms. Digital platforms remain extremely powerful, enabling them to pursue tactics of attrition in negotiations. Greater focus is needed to ensure that they are carried out in a fair manner, free from undue influence by virtue of their deep pockets. And the plan cannot solve without broader reforms to limit big tech. Brown and Agrawal 23. Granting news rights may prove ineffective without additional interventions that go beyond copyright. Strict antitrust enforcement, this requires governments to address the news publishers' lack of bargaining power. Effectiveness of additional rights remains dubious without additional measures in areas such as antitrust and guidance for licensing processes to support them. And if it's true that licensing is key, deals between publishers and AI companies should solve without licensing. This is Korak and Knoll 24. Intense financial pressure means that media companies are tempted by the prospect of incorporating AI. Big tech companies have told investors that they plan to spend tens of billions of dollars a year and are in an all-out race. To avoid the risk of missing out on a diversified revenue stream, many publishers are simply opting to meet with AI executives, hoping to see the advantages of being non-confrontational over copyright infringement concerns. Every industry is attempting to determine where AI fits within their specific field. Next, extend 1 and C2, which is the turn. In their rush to save journalism, they undermine the bedrock of free expression by weakening the fair use clause, which is our 1 and C Edwards piece of evidence. They answer this by just restating their internal link about helping journalism, but that is not our argument. They have dropped a legal spillover turn offense argument, which says that the courts will apply fair use differently. This outweighs their effect on journalism. Fair use is more important than free expression than generative AI ever will hurt it. Maintaining the right to have people use copyrighted material for free is necessary for all journalistic research. The plan creates a precedent that forces all companies to expect to be paid, which weakens democratic norms. That's our 1 and C Jarvis evidence. Next, extend 1 and C6. Democracy is resilient. That's our idea evidence. They say it's not, but this is just a warrant, not an assertion. They've conceded the warrants that our piece of evidence gives. If democracy can survive COVID, January 6th, losing a decades-long war in Afghanistan in defense of democracy, and backsliding in Myanmar, then global democracy can survive the New York Times making a few less dollars per year. This proves that even if they win, they do something to help democracy, it's not needed because democracy is already resilient now, which is our 1 and C idea evidence. And US democracy is strikingly resilient. January 6th only proves the stability of American institutions. DuPont 21. After unprecedented mayhem in the Capitol building, worse could follow. But American resilience and the capacity for renewal should never be underestimated. Biden was dismissed as weak, but he has come running back to life, especially since the defeat of Trump at the ballot box. Democratic triumph in Georgia gifted Biden mere control of both houses. Biden has seized the moral and political high ground, defending the Constitution, calling for unity, and holding Trump to account. A unifying message is resonating across the political divide. Only a vibrant and resilient democracy could have survived such an attack without breaking. The US survived the ultimate stress test and will emerge stronger for it. And democracy is resilient, but it solves nothing. Doran Spleet 19. This study search of a database pruned thousands of articles with analyzed democracy. A wave away has not happened. Democracy is not doing worse than before in comparative perspective. No consensus in the lit. Scholars claim that there is a consensus, ignoring the lit. Benefits are weak. Studies have not found a strong correlation between war at the dyadic level. There are other more powerful explanations because democracy is a spurious one. The causal mechanisms are unclear. Democracies are not more peaceful in general evidence at the monadic level. There's no link. Civil wars are just as unlikely in democracies. And there's no, extend 1 and C7. There's no impact of disinformation, which is our vital evidence. They say that polarization changes that. But again, just another assertion. You should prefer our evidence because their evidence is just citing somebody named Schmachtenberger who is basically making stuff up, but our evidence is citing Lytle, who is citing empirical studies that find that polarization and disinformation have very little effect on the way that people make decisions when they're engaging with media. You should always prefer studies over anecdotal evidence because anecdotal evidence is inherently suspect. Next, go on to the EU advantage. Extend 1 and C1. US-EU cooperation is high now, which is our Leiden evidence. This advantage is fixing a problem that does not exist. Both sides have already agreed to put guardrails on the responsible use of AI and are committed to reducing friction about broader AI issues in the relationship. This means that the plan isn't necessary to solve. Even if they win that the US and EU disagree over generative AI now, they're committed to working through all of the disagreements that they have on AI, so they will not let it spill over to affect broader relations. They say that the US and EU just signed an agreement, but that is false. Our evidence is talking about current things that they are doing to work through these problems in their relationship, which means that the plan is not necessary to save EU relations. And US-EU cooperation on AI is strong now, particularly over generative AI. This is Gritsky 24. The US and EU are in close contact over AI. A cooperation agreement between the true AI offices has developed a framework for evaluating generative AI. The two sides have also updated the list of mutually acceptable definitions related to AI. They made significant progress in defining milestones and deliverables in joint research. And US reliance on the EU is inevitable. Lawrence and Cordy 20. Despite financial and political efforts, the EU still remains technologically dependent on the US and China. And China suffers from a lack of capital and private funding, decentered and uncoordinated AI expertise, brain drain, and slow adoption of AI programming into its education and public sectors. Next, extend 1 and C2. There were all causes to an effective EU-US relationship. There is divergence over climate, other non-AI emerging technologies, NATO spending, and populism, which prohibit further cooperation even if they win that AI is important. They say that cooperation is regaining strength now, but there's no warrant for this. Our evidence outlines other issues that are more important than AI. And EU-US cooperation is irreparably destroyed. Stokes 22. Lofty expectations that Europe would be a priority in Biden foreign policy. 2021 was a year marred by friction, Afghanistan, AUKUS defenses, Russia and China. Relationship will never go back to 2016. China folks in the White House are driving the bus, and they don't have an appreciation of the EU. A pivot to Asia will lead to transatlantic decoupling. The first test could be Taiwan. And extend 1 and C5. US-EU climate cooperation is high. They've just signed a joint statement creating cooperation on supply chains, technological standards, export controls, and promoting green public policy. There's no reason that the plan would result in a form of cooperation that is more beneficial than what is already happening when both countries are committing to decarbonization, which is our 1 and C Picone piece of evidence. And EU-US climate cooperation is strong and scaling up efforts. This is Abdet and Volokovici 21. The US and the EU will pledge closer cooperation on fighting climate change. The summit marks the return of US-EU collaboration on fighting climate change. It plans for a transatlantic alliance to develop green tech and sustainable finance. It will also scale up efforts to meet their spending pledge to cope with global warming. The US pledged to double its climate funding by 2024.
You ready for cross-X?
Yeah, I'm good.
Fantastic. I'd like to talk about the first piece of new evidence you read for democracy being resilient, the DuPont evidence.
Yep.
The tag, it says January 6th proves that democracy is resilient.
Yep.
How did people create a community consensus that January 6th was bad?
That's not our argument. Our argument is that the democratic institutions are still just as strong as they were before January 6th, after January 6th.
Well, yes.
A sign of a strong democracy is their ability to survive an attack on the government and still come out of it just as strong as they were before.
But say we needed to know who was involved in January 6th and who wasn't. Would, say, investigative journalism be important?
I think it also begs the question of what journalism could possibly do to resolve this. If people currently don't believe journalism to the extent that they're willing to wage an insurrection, then the plan is not going to affect that.
Okay, let's talk about the Kurak and Knoll 24 piece of evidence, which I think you read right before it.
Yeah.
So do you think every new AI company should contact every new publishing company in order to make sure that there are cooperation?
Your argument is that the most important players for the health of journalism are large news companies like the New York Times. Our evidence says that those companies are already being proactive and signing deals with OpenAI now. That would be sufficient.
Well, I know you cut most of the, or all of the affirmative, but you did also cut a piece of evidence that says that small, local, niche, and non-English publishers are important. So what
And
about those?
Part of our
publishers?
argument is that the rest of the 1AC does not really have a piece of evidence establishing why those small local news companies are important to the health of
So
journalism.
diverse news media and a news ecosystem are not important for journalism or
Yeah.
democratic norms?
I mean, Peoria local news is not really the place that people get information about what is happening.
Not
around
even
the state.
local
It's kind of
news
just like
on
the New York
scale?
Times. No, well, our evidence is that says that the larger news companies are more important.
Okay, let's talk about the Dornschlicht 19 evidence. It has a lot of big words in it, dyadic, monadic.
Yeah,
What do
it's-
these mean?
It's citing a study. It's citing political science research. So your evidence is from somebody named Larry Diamond, who was like in the Bush administration and is just talking about all the stuff he thinks democracy does. Our evidence cites actual political science research that says that there is little support for, the dyadic tendencies of democracies actually preventing wars from happening in
Okay.
those political
So,
science diet.
Explain to me how two authoritarian states would come to a diplomatic agreement to not, say, escalate in the South China Sea.
They do all the time. China has already not escalated with the Philippines, which are two generally authoritarian states, but both of them have set very clear red lines about why they think escalation should occur.
And so
agreed not
you
to pass
don't
them.
think that China would, say, be aggressive in that hotspot?
Well, if it's true, it's not because they are not democratic, it's because they have other nationalistic objectives which democracy is
Other
unable to affect.
nationalistic objectives. And democracy does not check those
No,
nationalistic
democracies
objectives?
are nationalist all the time. Like, there are tons of wars that are started for nationalistic reasons in democracies like Iraq.
Alright, we've heard half of the negative block now. We just got to hear the 2NC from Gabe. And one thing that I really liked about Gabe's speech was when he was extending the on-case arguments, he did so by number and by name of the author, or kind of by re-describing what the argument was in the 1NC as the first thing, which helped keep in place Conor's 1NC numbering scheme and helped really keep the debate organized, so you always knew what argument we were talking about and what was their side of the argument and what was the AF's evidence about that, or what was the 2AC response to it. So on the journalism advantage, did Gabriel extend every single 1NC case argument on that advantage?
Drop the
So we're only talking about on the journalism advantage. So there were, how many arguments did we have in the 1NC on that advantage? Okay, so did he extend all 7 of those arguments, is the question I'm asking?
He extended like 3.
Right, so he did not choose to advance all 7 of the arguments that Conor made in the 1NC. Why would he make the choice to keep only a couple of those in play rather than all 7?
As the debate goes on, like the amount of arguments within a piece of paper or whatever you're arguing on like decreases.
Yeah,
Like,
so some
narrow
of
it
it is a
down.
little bit of a time issue, but some of it is also they are trying to consolidate their strategy and decide on a narrower set of arguments that they want to pursue. That's definitely right. Part of also why they might make that choice is they want to really develop and support a couple arguments in depth and be able to read more new evidence to help support those arguments. So we definitely had a lot of evidence in Conor's 1NC, but based on the files we have for camp, there's also a bunch of evidence that it's possible for the 2NC or the 1NR to read on any of the negative arguments as well, whether it's the on-case arguments against the advantages or the DAs. So for these on-case arguments, instead of shallowly talking about all 7 of them and not really having a chance to develop or read more evidence on them, Gabe's made a conscious choice of these are the ones that I want to advance that I think are still really strong and that I think we have even more evidence to back up. I also like that Gabe had his flows up with him as well as the computer. He definitely needed the computer because he was going to read more new evidence, but had his flows up to help keep himself accountable to not drop any of the arguments he wanted to extend and to not drop any of Don's responses in the 2AC to the arguments that he wanted to extend in the 2NC. What did we notice about when Gabe mentioned that there is, like, studies are better than anecdotal evidence? What kind of argument is that? Or what is he doing there? Yeah, in the back.
He's using an analytical argument.
It's definitely an analytical argument, but what do we think the purpose of introducing that statement is for the debate?
It's like evidence comparison to prove why your point's better.
Yeah, exactly. He introduced some new evidence comparison based on the rigor of the evidence and the rigor of the research that the authors that both sides are reading from are doing. So he suggested that doing an experiment or a study is preferable to anecdotes of evidence. Both teams have evidence on something, and that happens often in a debate, that both teams will have evidence that dispute each other. So then the judge has to think about who wins this argument if both teams have evidence on that question. Some judges may simply decide that if one team has more evidence on a question, that team will emerge victorious. Other judges may think that you need to win, that the quality of your evidence is better. So Gabe is offering a way to remedy that by offering that his evidence quality is better than theirs. And starting it early, still in a constructive speech, don't worry, Laurel will have a rebuttal to that claim and others, but they're starting to introduce some evidence comparison on issues where both teams have read a piece of evidence. So that was a good thing. The cross-ex of the 2NC it went well for both teams, and Don had started some questions with, I want to ask about this piece of evidence, and offered the author's name. Don even went a step further at some questions by saying, it was the first piece of evidence you read on this, or it was the second piece of evidence that you read on this, just in case Gabe would need to locate that evidence, or the judge would need to locate that evidence on their flow to think about it. And then once Don established we're both on the same page so that we know which evidence we're talking about, then he asked his question about that piece of evidence. There were still, even at this somewhat middle part of the debate, a lot of questions about the democracy portion of the journalism advantage. This time, not necessarily about whether the plan helps or harms democracy that were part of the earlier turn, but now there were a lot of questions about whether democracy is resilient or not, or whether the plan can actually do something helpful to improve democracy. So that issue seems to still be pretty salient and important in the debate, so there were still a bunch of questions asked about it. And there were not questions about things like the creativity advantage. There were not questions as much about some of the issues that were in the 1NC, but not extended in Gabe's speech, that are no longer relevant. I liked that both parties were willing to defend the rigor of their researchers and how they got to some of their conclusions, and seemed to know who their authors were as well as some of the other authors. Diamond was talked about. That's a pretty common author from year to year to talk about democracy, but even some of the less common authors that are not read every year in debates, people seem to know this is a political scientist or this is a journalist, and were willing to defend the credibility of who they were reading for their side of the debate. All right, so this is the half point in the debate. We're now going to take a short bathroom break, stretch break, get up, stretch your legs, get more paper if you need it. We're going to resume at 10:50, so it's a 10-minute break.
The order is the Farm Bill dissad and then the industry dissad. Farm Bill and industry.
Yeah, for sure.
On the Farm Bill dissad, we can see there is no impact to food wars. They do not have any offense, which means there is no risk of them turning the dissad. But even if they do, there would be no impact because we just conceded that there is none. Next, go to the industry dissad. On 2EC1, the dissad outweighs and turns case. 1. Chinese tech dominance spurs arms racing with insecure Western nations. An upset in strategic stability increases the risk of proliferation and miscalculation. Even a slight shift in China's favor causes aggressive posturing that escalates to extinction. That's J19. They drop the impact, which means there's a 100% risk of Chinese tech leadership causing extinction that lowers your threshold substantially to vote negative because they have no defense on it. 2. Chinese tech dominance turns both advantages. A. Chinese disinformation becomes infinitely more effective with better AI. Revisionist powers controlling media undermines democratic values and triggers their disinformation impact. And B. Geostrategic advantages granted through AI allow China to put stress on Western powers through expanded influence. That strains the connection between the EU and US and increases the number of challenges the alliance must face, doubling the risk of, eliminating the risk of the impact. On 2AC2. They say that the US is behind in the tech race, but 1. 2EC Lovelace doesn't say where China is ahead and admits China is behind in generative AI. They say random tech CEOs who refuse to give details, so they grant them very little extrapolation on the quotes later on. 2. Generative AI is key to the US's lead in AI. Zolshini 23. China faces significant challenges in AI. American firms continue to lead. China has several obstacles, various hurdles in language models, constraints in chip bans, and quality of data from Mandarin internet sources. 3. The US is winning the tech race now. Kim 23. The US will retain market leadership. Skeptics thought China would win. Every great AI innovation has emerged from the US. And 4. Generative AI will shape the future of AI and tech supremacy. Carpel 23. Generative AI could be the new battleground in the battle for tech supremacy between the US and China. Both China's military modernization, Chinese technology giants announced plans and launched for their own ChatGPT rivals. China sees AI development as a strategic priority. The battle for technology supremacy is about to enter prime time. On 2EC3. They say Horowitz is not credible, but 1. No reinvestment in AI post-plan. Wendy C. Calvert, which they claim says we will reinvest, is about investment in journalism, not artificial intelligence. The plan tanks the AI industry by causing billions of dollars in finance, royalties. And 2. Horowitz is credible. They never made an argument indicting the fact that there will be costs associated with the plan, and they will be massive. Licensing requires Gen AI companies to pay billions for everything they use for learning, which is an indisputable fact. On 2EC4. They say that legal uncertainty sinks AI, but on subpoint A, 1. No chilling effect. AI development has increased even in the face of litigation present now. That disproves any theoretical legal challenges in the future because the status quo has shown it is possible and sustainable. And 2. AI is legally sound. It is impossible to prove sourcing and impossible to win that your individual source was output as content because of the extensive learning process. Past cases prove that the legal defense works and it will continue to do so because the precedent has already been set that they can use this information. On subpoint B, 1. Licensing is an existential threat to generative AI. Specifically, it creates barriers to entry that weaken the innovative ecosystem. January 24. Even identifying works ingested by an AI model present daunting challenges. Royalties could pose an existential threat to emerging tech. Trying to disclose your sources when building an index is not possible. Beyond creators, that leaves little money. System would erect a large barrier to entry for new generative AI companies, cutting out smaller ones that might provide competition, innovation, or niche offerings. And 2. Strengthening copyright holders stifles the pace of innovation. Estes 24. If you have to go to copyright owners, you're going to get a lot less innovation. Copyright holders stifle progress. Few would disagree, progress has shaped the media business. AI destined to transform our understanding of copyright. On 2AC5. They say no link because there are large profit margins, but one. Wendy Horowitz says costs rise to tens of billions of dollars. Even the firms with the greatest margins and investment will falter due to that huge cost undermining the AI industry. 2. Copyright licensing kills AI and undermines useful applications of generative AI. Martins 24. Licensing of training inputs reduces the quantity of data and the quality of models. Transaction costs reduce competition. This slows down generative as well as productivity. It slows down economic growth compared to what it could be. And 3. The most direct risk to tech leadership is copyright restrictions on AI. Tycombe and Warrington 24. A ban on using news would doom the development of AI. It would be impossible to create services if it were prevented from relying on copyrighted works. Overregulation could lead to the West falling behind. Overbearing regulation, receding Western leadership to China, reshaping the global tech ecosystem.
Okay, the negative block is now complete. The negative team had those 2 speeches right in a row. How else did the negative block consolidate their strategy a bit? Yes, in the back. Okay, so they got rid of the Farm Bill DA. That might have been a mistake. We'll find out. But the negative team decided to get rid of one of their DAs and they extended the other one. So they kicked the Farm Bill DA. That just means that they're no longer trying to win that DA, but they acknowledge that the affirmative team might try to revive it in some way. So Conor decided to make a strategic concession that the food wars will not go nuclear, so that the affirmative team cannot try to gain any offense from their previous 2AC arguments. So kicking just means they've abandoned that DA. Now when the judges decide the debate, you will not have to look at your flow of the Farm Bill DA because the negative's last rebuttal is not going to try to win that disadvantage anymore. So when you all later make a decision about who wins the debate, you will not factor in the Farm Bill. Okay. Why do we think that Conor decided to let us know formally that he was kicking that DA at the beginning of his speech? Any guesses? Why? Yeah, in the middle?
So we could focus on that flow.
Okay, so that we would know right away that that was the consolidation of the strategy that was happening, and we could focus on it and know right away. That's one possible answer. You have a different answer?
There's like no risk that he doesn't forget to kick out of it.
Yeah, Conor's not a forgetful guy, I will say, after coaching him last year, but there is always a risk that if you leave it for the very end of your speech, you might accidentally forget to get rid of it, and then you kind of leave it in limbo for the affirmative team to wonder, what's up with that? Or the judge to think, like, why did they not make it clear whether they were choosing to advance it or not? Were they trying to and simply didn't cover it? So that's a great reason. There were some other hands, but I imagine that one of the answers that already was suggested was the answer you were going to provide as well. So there are varying takes about whether one ought to do the kicking at the very beginning of the speech or maybe some other point in the negative block. So Gabriel could have chosen to get rid of this disadvantage in his speech if he wanted to, and that would be perfectly fine. What's one reason that Gabriel might not have wanted to do that? Yeah.
To give less prep time and less reaction time to it.
Yeah, so it would definitely let the affirmative team know early that, oh, well, if Gabriel's getting rid of it in the 2NC, we know that Conor will not be advancing it in the 1NR. So then during the cross-examination between Dawn and Gabriel, then Laurel could have already been starting to prepare or know in advance that she would not have to answer the Farm Bill disadvantage in the 1AR and spend some more time prepping some of the other issues that are relevant to the debate. If Gabriel had decided to kick this disadvantage in his speech, he could have chosen to at the beginning of his speech or in between the case advantages, so in the middle of the speech, so as not to forget about it. Gabriel is also tends to not be a forgetful person, but just so that it doesn't happen right at the end of the speech and risk forgetting it. Okay, why do we think Conor took a different set of arguments than Gabriel, and is that allowed? Yeah.
It's splitting the block. It's
Yeah.
like strategy thing.
Exactly. It's a purposeful strategy. It's definitely allowed for the two negative block speakers to cover different issues and is encouraged as a strategy called splitting the negative block. So Gabriel took the on-case arguments relevant to the journalism and EU advantages, and then Conor decided to take the off-case positions, eliminate one, and cover the other one. And that was purposeful. Why do we think it's a good idea that they didn't cover the same subjects, even though they're partners on the same team? Sure, in the back.
You get more coverage for the learning chapter exit.
Yeah, so they could each cover in depth in some detail and add new evidence and new layers, new evidence comparisons. They could also divide up the work that is required to prepare on those issues and also avoid redundancy of covering the same stuff and saying some of the same things. All of the other speeches will be extending arguments that were previously in the debate. So this is the one time in the middle of the debate where the negative gets two speeches in a row and they get to sort of divide and conquer rather than cover the same exact topics in the negative block. So it would not have been a good strategy if Gabriel had covered the journalism advantage and then Conor also covered the journalism advantage. Unless Gabe just missed something and then Conor wanted to recover from whatever thing that Gabriel unfortunately missed. There was no cross-ex after this speech, so all the cross-exes are over at this point. Sometimes that influences what you decide to put into the 1NR speech. If it's a thing you don't want to be cross-examined about. Sometimes people will put that into the 1NR since there's no cross-examination after it. All right, now we're going to hear from the affirmative team again for the 1AR speech.
To be the journalism advantage, the EU advantage, and the industry decide. Okay, is everybody ready? Everybody ready? Time, begin. On the journalism advantage. Overview. Allowing AI companies to erode copyright protections is an existential threat to journalism. That's ROPEC 24 and RADS 24. That destroys democracy through misinformation campaigns, which causes extinction. That's Deliberation 24 and Diamond 19. The line by line. 1 and C1 is the solvency debate. Yes, the AF solves. Calvert is great on this question and points to empirics that licensing is good for journalism. The 2 and C cards they read are garbage. Calvert is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Brown is an intern, and Ardwall works for a tech institute. Next, they say Calvert's empirics are wrong, which is a bold claim to make, considering how much worse music piracy was for musicians. Spotify is a major improvement from the previous status quo, and it's the same scenario for artificial intelligence. 1 and C2 was the turn. This turn is nonsense. The risk is zero. The app does not collapse fair use. It fixes the legal loophole that AI companies are taking advantage of. That's 1AC ROPEC, and there's only a risk of our offense because fair use is already broken. there's only a risk the app fixes that, and their legal spillover are, there's no legal spillover because the only precedent the app sets is for AI use. Human created content is protected under plan, plus the only card they continue to cite here cites Jarvis, who is an industry hack who nobody likes or trusts. 1 and C6 was the democracy impact defense. But impact defense is a question of recency. Their evidence predates the rapid development of LLMs like ChatGPT, which didn't even get released until after their cards were published. Default to the app Hypervene evidence, it's from this year and is the only impact card that accounts for AI-enhanced disinformation, which is uniquely bad because of its wide scale and rapid production. That's the Honenberg evidence, which they dropped. They really focus on the COVID and January 6 examples, but those examples predate wide-scale large learning language models and rapidly increasing polarization. We're at a brink now that we weren't at 3 years ago. And yes, democracy solves. That's Diamond 19. That says democratic backsliding makes it impossible to prevent escalation and tyranny. Good luck solving global hunger when authoritarian overlords hoard our bread. 1 and C7 was the disinfo debate. Yes, there's an impact. Disinfo makes polarization inevitable. The Schmattenberger evidence is really good on this question. AI-generated misinfo floods the market with propaganda and bad faith arguments. This makes responses to existential crises impossible, and their Lytle card is hype. It falls short because it's not predictive. It's describing the status quo while the app is focused on the ever-increasing threat of AI development, increasing the rate of disinfo. It's inevitable as LLMs get more advanced. GPT 4.0 got released last month. What happens a year from now? Move to the EU advantage. We'll kick the EU DA on the climate impact defense. The ABNet card says the US and EU are already working on solving issues with climate change. There's no risk of neg offense on this advantage because there is no link turn extended to the 2NC. On the off case, industry dissent. 2AC1, the case outweighs and turns the dissent. Backsliding the US global democracy due to a collapse in journalism outweighs on magnitude because it increases Chinese dominance across all sectors, including tech and norm setting. That's Diamond. First, it's not 100% risk because China's tech dominance is already status quo. That's 2AC Lovelace. That means you should be highly skeptical about the strength of the negs links. Second, the DA doesn't turn the app because A, the app happens faster, and B, you should be skeptical of the disad turning our journalism advantage because their argument relies on non-existent evidence that Chinese AI disinformation campaigns have ever and will ever be an issue. 1AC evidence is specific to domestic disinfo that destroys our democracy, and arguing that Chinese disinfo is a threat concedes the case impact that disinformation is bad. Move it to 2AC number 2. That's the uniqueness debate. The US is losing already. China has pulled ahead in areas on AI. That's Lovelace, who cites people working with the Pentagon compared to their card from an associate editor for Fortune. Their first response here was that Lovelace doesn't specify Gen AI. We all have access to the file. We know Lovelace specifies Gen AI. And the second response is 2AC2. That was Gen AI is key, but the 2AC5 argument says that the app won't affect AI profitability. The third response was that the US is winning tech race now, but assumption that the US is automatically ahead are unfounded. That was 2AC Lovelace. 2AC3 was the no link. Their Horowitz evidence is hype. Making money off of AI should automatically preclude someone from having a valid opinion on AI regulation. Notice how they didn't defend him beyond saying he's credible. And the plan won't undermine profitability of the AI industry. They have huge profit margins already. The DA is just saying boo-hoo. That's Hill 623 that says investors are fighting lawsuits on a massive scale. They say they're forced to pay fees. The most succinct reaction is boo-hoo. The truth is that the investment sees AI as a gold mine. Then 2AC number 4, the link turn. Yes, there's a chilling effect. Legal uncertainty is increasing issue that will eventually tip the industry. 2AC SASBO 24 is really good on this question. Allowing AI to sit in legal limbo dooms it to fail. Second, the AI is not legally sound. It is possible to prove, so we're saying think of the ScarJo case. In sub-point 1, they said licensing is existential, but the Genre 24 card assumes it's not possible. That was done above.
How are we doing with our flowing? We still have a lot of space. Did we remember to leave some space at the top of the flow for that overview that the 1AR had? That's good. So this 1AR started with the on-case advantages and saved the DA, not the Farm Bill, but the industry DA for last. That's pretty common. as a general rule, would recommend putting the case advantages prior to the off-case positions. If Laurel had mismanaged her time, which she does not tend to do, but if she had and was not able to cover the disadvantage or was only able to get like one argument there, she potentially could still win that the case advantage simply outweighs the DA. That's one reason to put the case advantages before the off case. So that was a smart decision of how to sequence and give a roadmap and what issues to cover in the order that she chose. What did we notice happened before the line by line on the journalism advantage? Yeah, there was an overview. So just like in Don's 2AC on the journalism advantage, where he had an overview to reiterate, this is the impact to my advantage, and that my plan solves this impact to this advantage, and had some 1AC evidence there, the 1AR also chose to do that. And the purpose was again to reiterate the impact to the advantage, and that the plan can solve a really large impact. What happened to the other advantage, the EU advantage?
You got kicked.
It got kicked or abandoned. So the affirmative team is only choosing to pursue one out of their two advantages now. That's an act to help consolidate their strategy a bit. Why do we think that, or first of all, how did they choose to kick out of the EU advantage? What was the concession that they made? Yeah, in the back.
They said that the EU and the US were already working together.
Okay, anyone have something different? Yeah.
Didn't they concede that climate cooperation was already happening?
Those arguments are similar, yeah. So they chose to get rid of the advantage by conceding a defensive argument about the climate part of the advantage. And do we think that if you were this 1AR and you needed to get rid of one of the advantages, would that have been the one that you chose? And if not, why might you have chosen the other advantage? Do we think that was a good choice?
Yeah.
Sure.
I think that it wasn't a good choice. I think that they should have kicked out the journalism advantage because I think the impacts of the EU advantage much larger. They much largely outweighed the advantage, or sorry, they much largely outweighed the impacts of the journalism advantage.
Okay, so we just thought that EU advantage impacts were pretty big, and maybe that would be helpful to defeat the industry DA that's still left. What about, does someone think this one was a good choice to get rid of this advantage instead of the other one? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that coming back from all the evidence that they put about how EU and US cooperation either is already happening or like doesn't do anything is kind of hard given the time constraint of the 1AR. So I think that it would be a lot easier to do just the journalism advantage.
Okay, so you definitely agree with the choice to get rid of one of the advantages because they need time to fully cover in depth and in detail about one of their advantages if they're going to be able to use part of the case to outweigh and defeat the disadvantage, but they also just need time to cover the disadvantage since that was a big part of the negative block. All right, so that's good. So we have, what other factors might be important or a good reason to determine, should I keep advancing two of my advantages or should I get rid of one of them? Yeah.
I guess the link from AI to affecting US-EU relationship is largely well by the negative side. I think that's one of the major reasons that I would also agree with dropping EU.
Okay, so if we thought the quality of the evidence in the negative block and or the quantity of evidence that the negative block read on one of the advantages compared to the other one was really good, then we might choose to eliminate or not pursue any longer the advantage that the negative block covered way more and had really good evidence about. So if the affirmative team thinks that their evidence and their support for the journalism advantage is way better than the negative block's evidence about that advantage, that would be a good reason to keep pursuing the democracy advantage. or if they thought the democracy advantage has a better shot to defeat the industry DA or whatever the negative team's remaining offense is, that would also be a good reason to keep that advantage and discard the other one. Timing's definitely relevant to, do I think I have enough time to cover and respond to the negative block's attacks on both my advantages and the off-case position? If not, you might want to think about if I can get rid of one of my advantages. If there is offense on one of your advantages, such as if the negative block had advanced the argument that the plan actually hurts democracy, it would be a bit harder for the affirmative team to abandon that advantage. Why would that be true? Yeah, in the back.
Because you still have to answer the democracy turn, because if you don't answer the democracy turn, then you win, but democracy has the effect, so it still requires a decent amount of in-depth, like, going into it for you to get that.
Yeah, exactly. We gotta be really careful with any offense that might be on one of the advantages if we want to kick out of it. And I'm sure in your labs you'll cover in a bit more detail the best practices of how to kick out of an advantage or an off-case position when you're negative, and some of the, there are a few instances in which it is not possible to kick out of your advantage or to kick out of one of your off-case positions. So in this case, it was easy for the affirmative team to get rid of one of their advantages, and perhaps because of time or perhaps because of the evidence quality, they've decided to make a decision to do so. When Laurel made the argument that our evidence should be preferred because of our author's credentials, such as a professor or a CEO versus an intern, why do we think she initiated that argument? Yeah.
Because the negative had way more cards, so she can't say outweigh on quantity, so she needed to come up with another reason why her cards were better.
Yeah, her speech is time pressured. She has to respond to the whole negative block, their 8 + 5 minutes, in only 5 minutes. So she probably, unless she goes to her real true top speed, probably cannot read more evidence to help combat everything. So instead, she is offering, instead of quantity, I want to make an argument about the quality of my evidence and why it should be preferred. Because this, yet again, is another issue where both sides have some evidence. So when both teams have evidence to make on the same issue, then to help make the judge's life easier, then both teams should offer why is their evidence better. So while Gabriel made an argument about the rigor of the research that their researchers are using, such as the studies versus anecdotes, Laurel has now started an argument about the author's credentials, about a person who might have more advanced training or job training or a different advanced title versus someone who might be an intern. And don't worry, the 2NR still has an opportunity to respond to that, to describe why their authors are credible or offer different possibilities for evidence comparison, but that was a new one that was made in the 1AR. On the off-case positions, I liked that in this 1AR, instead of using Conor's 1NC numbering system, in the off-case position that's left, the industry DA, Laurel is modeling her extensions based on Dawn's 2AC. So when she got to the industry DA, she said, extend 2AC1, the case outweighs, and explained it. Rather than saying 1NC1, they said this, but Dawn said this, but then the block said this, but then now I'm going to say this. So when we're on the off-case positions, we're going to use our extensions modeled off of the 2AC when we're in the 1AR. All right, another possibility for another evidence comparison based on some author credentials that Laurel made in this speech was when she referenced the person Horowitz and said, they said he's credible, but didn't explain why. That offers a moment where she threw down the gauntlet and now is offering the 2NR the opportunity to either really defend that that person is credible or offer them the opportunity for them to institute a different metric for comparing that evidence other than author credibility. So we'll see what the 2NR does with that, and we'll see what it's likely we already know what the 2NR's way to win is going to be. What is their only remaining offense in the debate? So we got the industry DA, and it's likely that Gabriel will also pair some on-case arguments that will go well with be compatible with the industry DA as well. Let's see what choices he makes.
Wow. Okay. Order is the industry DA and then the journalism advantage. Oh, I see. Yes, yes. Okay. Everyone's good?
Yes.
Judges, collectively good? Cool. China tech leadership outweighs and turns the case. The 2AC has lost this debate when they failed to extend impact defense to our impact. I will make this debate extremely simple for you. Even if you think that they are winning offense on journalism, or there are some questions over whether or not the profits of generative AI is good, they have dropped that China tech leadership certainly causes global war, it certainly causes evil AI to take over the world, and it certainly turns the F. The impact of an authoritarian nation controlling global technology is far larger and more dangerous. The first argument they extended was 2AC1, that case turns the disadvantage. That's wrong. A. They've conceded our thesis claim that China uses tech dangerously and without respect to individual rights, which means that spread of disinformation is inevitable in a world where you vote F. The US will not be able to keep frontline states from turning towards authoritarianism if everybody in the world is using a phone and a car that runs on Chinese AI technology that is surveilling them. And it independently causes extinction through unrestrained emerging technology like quantum computing and autonomous weapons. Again, conceded. B. Tech changes destroy strategic stability and dominance gives China the confidence that they can escalate and win wars, which causes wars over places like Taiwan and the South China Sea, which is our Jane evidence. Second was 2AC2, that China is ahead now. That's wrong. They've dropped the generative AI's key and that China has no equivalent to ChatGPT, even if they have some AI innovation in other areas of the industry. The Zucchini evidence has a 1R warrant that is about market share, which says that US market share is still way bigger and it will remain that way for the foreseeable future, which is our Kim evidence. And this argument barely matters when we're winning so far ahead on the magnitude of the link argument. 2AC3, they extended that Horowitz is bad. They did not answer our prototype, which is that only industry insiders know about the inner workings of the profit model of the AI industry. And even if they win that our authors are biased, that's okay because they have granted us the presumption that amazing tech companies are way better and are the reason that we are able to win the war, the tech war with China. 2AC4. They've extended that there's a legal chilling effect, but 1R explicitly answered this argument by saying that it's empirically false because AI development has increased even in the face of all the legal uncertainty that they are highlighting, which disproves theoretical challenges in the future. Our 1NC Horowitz evidence says that it costs billions and stifles the innovation ecosystem. Conor's 1R analysis was amazing and says that it forces them to pay literally hundreds of billions of dollars for all the different royalties. The 1R Johnner evidence says that this is, quote, an existential threat to the industry of artificial intelligence. Next, cross-applied Martins 24 from 2AC5, licensing kills useful applications of generative AI by creating transaction costs and weakening competition. Even if there's legal uncertainty, they are protected by strong fair use protections now, which is their own inherency evidence. The last thing, they read this new piece of Hitzig evidence that says that profits are not key. This would have been a good argument, but again, they've conceded the premise that only generative AI can keep our military innovative enough and keep our economy productive enough to stave off tech dominance. That was the 1R Tickcomb and Warrington evidence, which says that, quote, only overbearing regulations risk ceding Western leadership to China and reshaping the global tech ecosystem. Now on to the journalism advantage. First, extend 1 and C1. The plan alone is insufficient to resolve journalism. Our evidence cites their specific proposal to collective licensing and concludes that the plan is just one thing that is necessary to help industry stave off a global wave of bad news for the news industry. Small news companies will get gamed by big tech companies in negotiations because they have ridiculously deep pockets and will force them to sign licensing deals for mere pennies that do nothing to preserve their bottom line. The F has no answer at any point in the speech to this general model about big tech companies gaming news companies in negotiations. Their indictment about Brown and Agrawal is wrong. They've also conceded another successful example of licensing, which was the country of France. But our evidence says that the only reason that worked is because France had a much stronger state that was much more willing to apply antitrust protections than the US ever would be, because the US is in the pocket of big tech. Next, we won't extend 1C7, which is the disinformation defense, because the disad turns it, because China will conquer the world with chatbots that are propagandistic and the world with the app. But you should extend 1C6, which is that democracy is resilient. They say it's a question of date, but that is incoherent, especially in the context of our evidence citing political science studies that prove that democracy does not actually solve war the way that their evidence applies. Our evidence says that, quote, there is a huge amount of literature finding the opposite conclusion, and that, quote, there is not a strong correlation between democracy and war in the literature. You should prefer empirical evidence actually breaking down the correlation between democracy and war in the literature, rather than their assertions, which is just that democracy is able to solve a variety of wars. Even if Don sounds good, he doesn't have empirical evidence backing what he's saying.
So I hope the applause will be just as loud for the AF team after the 2AR is over. Alright, so this 2NR, what did they go for? What was their offense? Was it what we predicted it would be? Industry DA, and some of the case defense. So the offense that they went for was, as we predicted, the industry DA. The Farm Bill was not revived. It was kicked appropriately before. So this is their primary form of offense. And it is very common for the 2NR to begin with their own offense, the industry DA, and then go to the affirmatives case advantages. The 1AR read one new piece of evidence in her speech. Did Gabriel respond to that in the 2NR? Okay, we think Gabriel did do that. Did he read new evidence to respond to the 1AR's evidence? So he analytically discredited it. He could have chosen to read a new 2NR piece of evidence that's not totally prohibited, but he chose to analytically discredit it. That's right. So Conor's 1NC on this journalism advantage was 7 arguments. Gabriel consolidated that down to fewer in the 2NC. Did the 2NR do further consolidation, or did they go for everything that the 2NC did on the journalism advantage? What do we think?
Further consolidation.
Yeah, they decided to get rid of at least one of the arguments about disinformation defense, which I think was the last or 7th argument in Conor's 1NC. So he chose to abandon that argument on the case and instead consolidate to develop and support other arguments on the journalism advantage instead. What about the EU advantage? Did Gabriel go to that? And do we think that was appropriate? Yes, since the EU advantage was kicked by Laurel in the 1AR, and there was no offense that Gabriel wanted to revive on that advantage to trick them in any way, or to defeat them in some way to claim that they had offense, because they didn't have any. So it was kicked appropriately and no longer relevant to the debate. There are now only 2 pages that in the final 2 rebuttals, the negative team and the affirmative team need to discuss anymore. Those are the journalism advantage and the industry DA. So Gabe covered both of those pages. Yeah, you have a question about that?
Yeah, well, so that's something you said before. On 7 for case, what was the thing that was said right before he actually kicked it? Like there was some preface to the we're not going to extend this, but
Yeah,
what was that
so
about?
the thing that he was doing there when he said, I'm not gonna go for this argument about disinformation, but there is still something a bit relevant here, is that the affirmative team is likely to still try to win that disinformation is a big deal and that the affirmative plan can prevent some of that. However, Gabriel has suggested that the disadvantage might actually turn that impact. What does it mean if the DA turns the case? Yeah, try it.
The DA turns the case. That
Yeah.
means Neg will have 2 offenses and the App will have 0.
Maybe, but we're trying to more just define what would it mean for a DA to turn the case. Yeah.
The impact of the disact causes the impact of the affirmative.
Yeah, roughly that can be right. So that the disadvantage impact, which, what was that again?
Industry.
China
So China, if
China surveillance and disinformation.
Yeah, so if China gets ahead in the tech race and establishes tech dominance over the United States, that will create some bad problems, possibly a war, but also that if they get ahead in the tech race or the US falls behind, then that might create the conditions for disinformation, which is one of the affirmative impacts. So instead of the negative team saying disinformation isn't really that big of a problem, they're instead saying that if they're right about the disadvantage, much more disinformation will be created. Okay, that was a good question. So the only 2 pages left for both teams' final rebuttals to cover are the journalism advantage and the industry DA. So your Farm Bill page and your EU advantage page, whatever you decide this debate on, and we'll talk about how to make a decision and what you should write and be prepared to defend to your lab leaders later today about who you think won and lost. Those should only be about journalism and the industry DA. So we're going to hear one final speech from Don in just a second to hear what choices he will make to defend his own case and to defend against the DA that remains.
The order for the 2AR will be the journalism advantage and then the industry disadvantage. Okay, y'all ready? Y'all ready? Okay. You are voting affirmative for 2 reasons. First, you know that the decline of democratic norms outweighs on magnitude and probability. Democratic institutions, the norms they project, outweigh a race for tech leadership because norm projection is an impact filter, meaning it prevents the wars in hotspots, even in a world of China winning a tech leadership race, but also with other authoritarian countries like Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and areas like Ukraine, the Balkans, and the Middle East. This means that our impact accesses their impact because authoritarian countries will be signaled by a lack of democratic norms as a green light to bully other countries, especially in areas and sectors like technology. Second, even if you think Gabe is winning some case defense about the resiliency of democracy writ large, you should be suspicious about the link to the AI industry dissent, because their evidence is written by a hack investment company and because regulation will not tank the industry by the least biased information. Both mean that the link to the DA is incredibly small, so even if you think some risk of journalism isn't necessary for democracy, you know the affirmative is larger than the small DA. Now, 1 and C1. Copyright is fundamentally necessary for the journalism industry. AI will crowd out both big and small publishers, which pollutes and undermines the news ecosystems. If you were a publisher, you would always prefer paying little to nothing for an artificial intelligence summary instead of an expensive, in-depth, and in-person journalist. The sole example the block gave was of the music industry, which flows affirmative, as Laurel said, because Spotify licensing is infinitely better than the earlier model of pirating all of your music. Yes, we had answers to big talks, specifically that licensing has empirically been beneficial to news industries. That was the 1AC Calvert evidence. Even if it would be nice to have additional protections like antitrust laws, Gabe's very example of the music industry proves because there are large producers and you still have protection. Gabe did not answer the indicts of their author, he just said they were wrong without warrant. But Brown is an intern and Archibald is a student in law. Calvert is a research fellow and professor emeritus in law, so you know it's better. 1NC6 is democracy is not resilient, but it is necessary to have journalism for democracy to be resilient in the first place. Gabe focused a lot on outdated statistics with big words, but not explain how they interact with large language models, which is important because disinformation, specifically from large language models, as they agreed on the disadvantage, is necessary and for new disinformation right now, which means you need to focus on how that disinformation is resulting in democracy declining right now, not outdated statistics. And go to the industry data. 2AC1, the case outweighs and turns the disadvantage. Democracy is necessary for U.S. leadership in every sense and sector, which includes tech leadership, because the benefits of democratic institutions means that there are diplomatic means to negotiate out of hotspot escalation. So their scenario of Chinese leadership only becomes existential if more backsliding happens. And as Laurel pointed out, the 1NR conceded that the disinformation internal link, which is quality of journalism decreasing, results in risk because they agreed Chinese misinformation collapses institutions and makes responding to threats impossible. They keep going on about how the impact has been conceded since the 2AC, but that is because it is included in democratic backsliding. If China were to win a tech leadership race, it would only be because we do not have democratic institutions to keep them in check when they are trying to escalate hotspots. Now, they also say a couple other things on this impact, but mostly they are posturing. The 2AC was clear that the comparison of our impacts means that you must prevent democracy from backsliding first. Now, 2AC2, the US is falling behind China on AI, including the best in-class open source AI, which is what they care about. That was the 2AC Lovelace card. Open source AI is being implemented in the Chinese military structure right now, which means the US is already far behind. Remember, our evidence is citing AI experts who are talking to the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, where the 1NR evidence is from random analysts talking to CEOs of tech companies who are, again, biased when it comes to it. They say that they are the only ones talking about Gen AI, but we're the only ones talking about who has tech in the military, which is the important internal link for tech leadership for China. And 2AC3, the Horowitz evidence is horrible. It is an investment company hack, not an expert on AI, and they want to maximize the return on investments. They keep citing hundreds of billions of dollars without any citation or footnote in the link evidence, which means you default to the Hitzlick evidence from the 1AR, which Lauren read. It gives an unbiased number on AI profits, $18 billion in the last quarter alone. Specifically, the experts agree that the DA is screaming, boo-hoo, I can only make tens of billions of dollars a quarter. Which means that the disad is comparatively tiny to the democratic backsliding being fundamentally necessary to preventing AI, hotspots, tech leadership, and wars with China and Russia.
Alright, that was the last speech of this debate. We got 2AR. The 2AR chose to start with the affirmative team's offense, their advantages, and then second did the negative team's offense, the DA. That's very common for 2ARs to start that way, to start with their own offense, the advantages, versus whatever the negative team's offense is, the DA, rather than the other way around. Really liked that Don gave some credit to 1AR arguments and partner Laurel, and that's really helpful to make you seem like a very unified team to the judge, especially in the last rebuttals. Not that Gabe didn't also do that with Conor, but that was a good thing in both of the last rebuttals. Don also made some statements that began with, even if they win this argument, which is a really good and common strategy in the last rebuttals, because most of the time in your debates, you will not sadly win 100% of all of your arguments in 100% of all of your debates. So that means that you do sometimes have to give credit to the opponent and assume they may win an argument or two, even though we don't like it. And why do we still win the debate, even if they win an argument or two? Or even if they win their best argument, why do we still win the debate? So those even if statements are really helpful in rebuttals. All right, so before lunch, you now have a really important task to do before you leave the room for the DCT or wherever you're eating for lunch today. So I want you to take your old Farm Bill flow. Take the back of it, the blank. That's what you'll use for the thing that I'm about to describe. First thing you should do with that back side of the Farm Bill flow paper, put your name and put your lab name. So like, if your name's Dawn and you're in the Mouse and Stupid lab, that's what you would put. So your name, then put your lab name, which is your lab leader's names. Then you, yeah, go ahead.
Can I just put their initials?
Sure, you can put their initials, so if you're MS, cool, PT, perfectly fine, KM, that's fine. So your next task, after you write your name and your lab name on the old Farm Bill flow, you're going to think about the following questions and respond to them. Which team do you think won the debate? The affirmative or the negative? You've only got two choices. There are no ties in these debates. Can't give a double win. So who do you think won the debate, the affirmative or the negative? The next thing you'll think about is what speaker points would you give these four debaters on a scale of 0 to 30, where 30 is good. You have their names and their speaker positions, so you're going to assign them some speaker points. Most tournaments do not allow you to give ties, so you can't like give two people in the debate both a 29, for example. You have to pick a different number. All right, so after your name, your lab, I voted for the F or the neg, and you've given out some speaker points. Then I want you to think about what are the big issues left at the end of the debate that you would need to decide for who wins and loses the debate. So what are the big issues left in the debate to decide? Then you'll think about who you thought won each of those big issues and why. So you've got some tasks to fill out. Old Farm Bill flow is what you're using. Your name, your lab. I voted for which team you chose. Give them speaker points. What the big issues left were. Who you thought won each of the big issues. Typically judges don't collude with each other to help make their decision, even when there's a panel of judges. And why you thought the team you thought won the debate on those issues and the whole debate. After you are done,